Hello there and welcome. Find a nice, comfortable spot to settle into. Let your shoulders relax, let the day's worries drift away on a gentle breeze. Tonight we are going on a quiet journey back in time, not to witness a grand battle or a royal coronation, but to investigate a curious and rather charming mystery. It's a story about a creature we all know and love. A creature that right now might even be. We're talking about cats. Those soft, purring, independent, and occasionally chaotic little companions that fill our homes and our hearts. But there was a time when the sight of a cat padding silently through a moonlit alley would not inspire warmth, but a chill of profound suspicion. A time when their quiet gaze was seen not as affection, but as a silent judgment from another world. So take a slow, deep breath. Let the familiar world around you fade into a soft blur. And let's travel back to the misty, superstitious heart of the Middle Ages to uncover the secret and allegedly sinister life of cats. Our story begins in a world lit by firelight and fear. Imagine a small village in medieval Europe, a place nestled in a damp valley where the houses are made of wattle and daub and the roofs are thick with thatch. Let's call our village Muddle on the Marsh. Life here is simple, dictated by the seasons and the church bell. The world is full of hard work, simple faith, and a deep, abiding belief in things The forests are home to ancient spirits, the night is full of omens, and the line between the natural and the supernatural is very, very thin. In Muddle on the Marsh, cats were, for a very long time, just cats. They were useful, practical creatures. They were nature's perfect pest control. A good cat in your barn was worth more than a scarecrow, keeping the rats and mice from the precious grain stores. They were silent, efficient, and largely ignored, like a self-operating piece of farm equipment. They came and went as they pleased, independent contractors in the war against vermin. They were respected, but not revered. They were simply part of the background tapestry of life. But then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift. It didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual change, a slow curdling of perception born from whispers in the tavern and nervous glances over garden fences. Perhaps it all began with Agnes, the baker's wife. One evening, as she was kneading dough by the warm glow of her oven, she happened to look out her small window. There, sitting perfectly still on the fence post, was a sleek black cat. It wasn't doing anything, it was just sitting there, a silhouette against the rising moon. But it was the way it was sitting, so still, so patient, and it was staring directly at her. Its eyes, two luminous green discs in the gathering dark, seemed to look not just at her, but into her. Agnes felt a sudden prickling chill run down her spine. The cat didn't blink, it just watched. She quickly made the sign of the cross and shuttered her window, her heart beating a little faster. The next day at the market, she mentioned to a friend how a cat had sat and stared at her with an unnatural stillness. The friend nodded gravely, and the first tiny seed of suspicion was planted. Then there was Thomas the Thatcher, a pragmatic man, not given to flights of fancy. One morning, as he was walking to work, a ginger cat darted across the path in front of him. It was a normal enough occurrence, but a few moments later, the latter he had propped against a cottage slipped, sending him tumbling into a soft but undignified pile of hay. He wasn't hurt, but he was startled. As he dusted himself off, his mind began to work. The cat had crossed his path. And then misfortune had befallen him. He didn't draw a firm conclusion, not yet, but he did mention it to the men he shared an ale with that evening. A strange coincidence, he mused. The cat, and then the fall. The men murmured their agreement. Another seed had been planted. The cats themselves, of course, were blissfully unaware of this shift in their public relations. They continued to be, well, cats. They possessed a set of qualities that were, to the straightforward God-fearing mind of a medieval villager, deeply unsettling. Firstly, there was their silence. A dog would announce its presence with a bark. A cat could appear as if from thin air. One moment a room would be empty, the next a cat would be sitting on the hearth, washing its face, having made no sound at all. This supernatural stealth was not seen as a skill for hunting mice. It was seen as unnatural. It was the way a ghost might move. Then there was their independence. You did not own a cat in the way you owned a sheep or a cow. A cat owned itself. It would accept your offering of milk. It might grace you with a moment of affection, a soft purr against your leg, but it was not truly yours. It had its own secret life, its own mysterious errands to run in the dead of night. It came and went according to a set of rules and a schedule that no human could comprehend. This fierce autonomy was deeply suspicious to a society built on strict hierarchies of lords, peasants, and livestock. A creature that served no master but itself was an anomaly, and finally there were their eyes. In the daylight they were beautiful jewels of green or gold, but at night, in the flicker of a candle or the glow of a fire, they would catch the light and shine with an eerie, otherworldly luminescence. To a villager huddled in their small, dark home, seeing a pair of glowing eyes staring out from the darkness was a terrifying sight. It was the gaze of a creature that could see things in the night that men could not, a creature that was at home in the world of shadows. The whispers in Muddle on the Marsh began to grow louder. Old Man Hemlock, who lived at the edge of the woods, swore he saw a group of cats gathered in a circle in a moonlit clearing, sitting in perfect silence as if listening to a silent sermon. Young Mary the milkmaid claimed a barn cat had followed her home, its shadow seeming to stretch and twist into a strange shape in the... These were small things, tiny observations, harmless in themselves, but in the fertile soil of the medieval imagination, an imagination that saw omens in the flight of birds and the devil in a sudden storm, these seeds of suspicion began to sprout. They were warded by fear and tended by gossip. The cat was no longer just a useful mouser. It was becoming something else, something mysterious, something that walked the thin line between our world and the next, something that watched from the shadows with knowing, silent eyes. And so, as you settle deeper into your own comfortable quiet, let this thought be a gentle companion. The next time your cat, a creature of soft fur and gentle purrs, sits and stares at you from across a darkened room, its eyes glowing softly in the lamplight, perhaps the villagers of Muddle on the Marsh weren't entirely wrong. It is a little bit spooky, isn't it? The seeds of suspicion once planted began to sprout in the fertile ground of medieval superstition. A silent stare, a sudden appearance, a coincidental stumble, these small oddities started to weave together into a more cohesive and much more sinister narrative. But a villain needs a partner, and the cat, with its growing reputation for mystery, was about to be cast in a dark and dramatic role. It was about to become the perfect accomplice for that other great figure of village fear, the witch. Now, the medieval witch was not yet the green-skinned, pointy-hatted figure of modern fairy tales. She was often something far more mundane, and therefore far more believable to the people of the time. Let us imagine a woman named Old Elspeth, who lived in a small, crooked cottage at the very edge of Muddle on the Marsh. Elspeth was not a witch. She was simply an old woman. Her husband had passed years ago. Her children had grown and moved away. She lived alone, tending to her small herb garden, her back stooped from a lifetime of hard work, her face a lovely road map of wrinkles. Elspeth was a woman of knowledge. She knew which herbs could soothe a fever, which roots could ease a toothache, and which poultices could draw the infection from a wound. For this, she was both respected and quietly feared. But her greatest crime in the eyes of the village was her solitude. In a world where everyone was part of a bustling family unit, a woman who lived alone was an anomaly, and lonely people, then as now, often seek companionship in animals. Elspeth had a cat. His name was Patches. He was a scruffy, clever creature with one black ear and a mottled coat that looked like a collection of leftover scraps of fur. Patches was not a demon or a goblin in disguise. He was just a cat. He did cat things. He slept in sunbeams. He chased mice with ferocious dedication. He enjoyed a good scratch behind the ears. And he had an insatiable curiosity about anything that smelt remotely like food. And it was these very normal, cat-like behaviours that would soon become evidence in a trial of whispered accusations. The story of their partnership in perceived evil began, as many village dramas do, with a piece of fish and a nosy neighbour. Let's imagine Elspeth's neighbour, a woman named Prudence, who possessed a curiosity as sharp as her sewing needle. One afternoon, Prudence was tending to her cabbages when she saw Patches padding silently along the top of the low stone wall that separated their property. In his mouth, he held a prize, a small, silvery fish, stolen no doubt from the basket of a careless fishmonger at the market. Patches leapt down into Elspeth's garden, trotted to her door, and dropped the fish at her feet with a proud, chirping meow. Elspeth, seeing the offering, chuckled. "Oh, you clever boy," she said, picking up the fish. "A gift for the old woman, is it?" Prudence, however, saw something very different. She did not see a petty thief and a fond owner. She saw a magical act. How else could a simple cat acquire a perfect fresh fish? It hadn't been fishing. It hadn't been to market. The fish had simply appeared. Clearly the cat was a familiar, a spirit helper in animal form, gifted to a witch by the devil himself to do her bidding, and it was magically providing food for its mistress. That evening the story Prudence told at the tavern was not about a stolen fish, but about a demonic creature summoning sustenance from thin air. The misunderstandings began to pile up, each one adding another layer to the dark legend. Elspeth, like many lonely people, talked to her cat. As she stirred her cooking pot, she would tell Patches about her day. "Ah, this stew needs a bit more time, don't you think, Patches?" she would murmur. If Patches meowed from the doorway, she might reply, "Oh, you want to go out, do you? Very well, off you go." To us, this is normal. To a villager like Thomas the Thatcher, who happened to be passing by her open window, it was deeply sinister. He did not hear a woman talking to her cat. He heard a woman conferring with her cat. They were having a conversation. She would speak, and the creature would reply in its strange, arcane language. He hurried to the tavern, his eyes wide, to report that he had heard old Elspeth and her familiar plotting in the language of sorcery. The cat's natural grace and stealth became further proof. Patches had a habit of appearing silently in doorways, a skill all cats possess. But when Agnes the baker's wife went to deliver a loaf of bread to Elspeth, and Patches suddenly appeared at her feet without a sound, Agnes let out a shriek. She later swore that the cat had materialized out of the very shadows, that it had passed through the solid wood of the door. The story spread like wildfire. Elspeth's familiar was no ordinary animal. It was a spirit that could walk through walls. And so every innocent, everyday cat behaviour was reinterpreted through this new dark lens. When Patches arched his back and hissed at a stray dog, he was revealing his demonic form. When he sat purring on Elspeth's lap as she spun wool, he was graining her life force to power his magic. When his eyes glowed in the firelight, he was gazing into the flames to see the future. The medieval paparazzi, the nosy Prudence, the tail-spinning Thomas, and the young, overly zealous parish priest who saw the devil's work around every corner fanned the flames. They were the reporters, the broadcasters of this unfolding drama. They didn't need facts. They had conviction. They saw a lonely old woman who knew a little too much about herbs, and they saw her silent, independent, unnervingly intelligent companion. And in the simple, loving bond between a woman and her pet, they saw a pact with the forces of darkness. The quiet affection between them was twisted into something monstrous. The truth was simple. Elspeth was a lonely old woman, and Patches was a cat who liked fish and a warm place to sleep. But in the world of Muddle on the Marsh, this truth was far too boring. The story of a witch and her demonic familiar was far more exciting. And so the legend grew, and the cat, once a humble mouser, was now officially a suspect. As you let your own mind begin to drift and quiet down, you might ask yourself the same question the villagers never did. Were cats magical, or were they just very good at looking mysterious? If all cats were beginning to be viewed with a new and nervous suspicion, one particular type of cat was fast on its way to becoming the prime suspect in any and all unexplained misfortunes. The ginger cat, the tabby, and the tortoiseshell might have been mysterious, but the black cat was mystery incarnate. It was a creature seemingly spun from the very shadows it so gracefully inhabited. In our village of Muddle on the Marsh, there was one such cat. He belonged to no one and everyone. He was a sleek, handsome creature with fur the colour of a moonless midnight and eyes like polished emeralds. The villagers didn't give him a name. They simply called him the Black Cat, a title they uttered with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. This cat, more than any other, became the focal point of the village's growing anxiety. The problem with the Black Cat was its unique talent for camouflage. At night it was practically invisible. It could be sitting on a dark woodpile or resting in the shadow of a wall, and you would never know it was there until you were right upon it, and it would startle you with a silent leap or the sudden unnerving gleam of its eyes. This ability to merge with the darkness was not seen as a clever evolutionary trait for a nocturnal hunter. It was seen as proof of its supernatural nature. The villagers began to whisper that the Black Cat wasn't just hiding in the shadows. It was the shadows. They believed it could dissolve into darkness at will, a form of shape-shifting. Let's imagine our friend Thomas the Thatcher, a man already prone to seeing omens after his unfortunate incident with the ladder. One evening, as twilight settles over the village like a soft grey blanket, he is walking home. He sees the Black Cat sitting calmly in the middle of the path ahead. Its form is a perfect dark silhouette against the fading light. Thomas, his heart beginning to beat a little faster, stops. He doesn't dare walk past it. He blinks, and for a fraction of a second his eyes adjust to the deepening gloom. When he looks back at the spot, the cat is gone. In reality, the cat, being a cat, had simply gotten bored and padded silently into a nearby bush. But Thomas did not see that. He saw a creature that was there one moment and gone the next, vanished. He scrambles home, his mind racing. Later that night at the tavern, the story he tells is not of a cat wandering off. He swears, his hand on his heart, that he saw the Black Cat dissolve into thin air. A few of the more imaginative listeners embellish the tale. Perhaps it didn't just vanish, perhaps it transformed. One man claims his cousin in a neighbouring village saw a black cat turn into a tall, shadowy figure wearing a cloak. By the end of the evening, it has become an accepted, if unspoken, fact in Muddle on the Marsh. The Black Cat was a demon or a witch, or perhaps the devil himself, amusing himself by taking on a feline form. This belief led to a new and rather comical village-wide pastime, the Great Black Cat Avoidance. The cat, for its part, remained entirely unconcerned. It enjoyed sitting in the sun, and the sunniest, warmest spot in the village was often a large, flat stone right in the middle of the main square. This created a daily logistical nightmare for the superstitious populace. Picture the scene. Agnes, the baker's wife, emerges from her shop carrying a large basket of freshly baked loaves to deliver to the manor house. She sees the Black Cat enjoying a peaceful nap on the centre stone. Agnes freezes. She cannot possibly walk past it. To do so would surely curse her bread, or worse. So she decides to take a detour. This involves her trying to climb over a low but very muddy pigsty wall. She manages to get one leg over, but her dress snags on a loose stone. As she tries to free herself, her basket tips, and 3 of her finest loaves tumble directly into the muck. She stares at her ruined bread, sighs, and glares at the sleeping cat, blaming it entirely for her misfortune. Next comes the parish priest, a man who should be above such superstitions but absolutely is not. He sees the cat, his mortal enemy, blocking his path to the church. He mutters a quick prayer under his breath and decides to take the long way around, a path that takes him behind the blacksmith's forge. He fails to notice a pile of discarded horseshoes and trips, sprawling into a puddle of grimy rainwater and ruining the hem of his pristine white robe. As he picks himself up, muddy and indignant, he casts a dark look towards the square. The cat, he is certain, planned this. It was a deliberate act of demonic sabotage. The villagers' attempts to actively deal with the cat were even less successful. They were too afraid to touch it, but they would try to shoo it away from a safe distance. Thomas the Thatcher, emboldened by ale one afternoon, decided he would be the hero. He picked up a small, smooth pebble, intending to toss it near the cat to startle it. His aim, however, was terrible. As the pebble sailed wide, bounced off the tavern's wooden signpost, ricocheted back, and hit him squarely on the forehead with a comical thwack. Through all of this, the black cat barely moved. It might occasionally open one lazy green eye to observe the strange, chaotic ballet of the humans around it, before closing it again with an air of profound indifference. The villagers stumbled, dropped things, got muddy, and even managed to injure themselves, all in a desperate effort to avoid a small, furry creature that was, at that moment, probably just dreaming about mice. The bad luck wasn't coming from the cat. It was coming from their fear of the cat. They were the architects of their own minor calamities. And so, as we settle into the quiet of our own less superstitious night, we can perhaps appreciate the gentle absurdity of it all. How many medieval villagers does it take to avoid a black cat? Apparently quite a few, and they still managed to fail. As the reputation of the cat grew more mystical and more sinister, a strange thing began to happen. The very qualities that made the cat feared also made it, in a peculiar way, medically interesting. In the world of medieval medicine, a world governed not by science but by a complex mixture of herbalism, faith, and the theory of the four humours, anything that possessed a strong supernatural aura was believed to have potent properties, and so the cat, already a suspected witch's familiar and an omen of bad luck, was about to add a new and even more bizarre title to its resume: reluctant medical device. Let's pay a visit to the local physician of Muddle on the Marsh. We shall call him Master Gilbert. Master Gilbert is not a doctor in our modern sense. He is a man of great learning, which is to say he owns 3 books, one of which is an almanac. He is a firm believer that all illness stems from an imbalance of the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. His primary tools are a chart of the zodiac, a jar of leeches, and a very serious expression. Now, Master Gilbert had been observing the growing folklore around cats with great interest. A creature that could move silently, see in the dark, and communicate with spirits must surely possess a powerful internal energy. And where there was energy, there was a potential for healing. He began to develop a series of new cat-centric therapies. Our first case study is young Timothy, the blacksmith's son, who is suffering from a terrible fever. Master Gilbert is summoned. He examines the boy, feels his hot forehead, and nods gravely. The boy is afflicted with an excess of hot and moist humours, he declares. We must draw the sickness out. His prescription is not a bitter tonic or a bloodletting. Instead, he instructs the boy's mother to find a cat, any cat would do, though a particularly lazy one was preferable, and place it on the boy's bed. The theory was simple if profoundly flawed. The cat, being a creature of the night and of cold, mysterious energies, would act like a sort of spiritual sponge. It was believed that the cat's body would naturally absorb the excess heat and the sickly vapours emanating from the boy. The cat, in essence, would inhale the illness. The blacksmith's wife, desperate, does as she is told. She finds a large, sleepy tabby cat from the barn and gently places it at the foot of Timothy's bed. The cat, finding a warm and comfortable spot, kneads the blankets contentedly, curls up into a ball, and immediately falls into a deep, purring sleep. It does absolutely nothing to cure the boy's fever, of course, but the rhythmic, gentle purring does seem to calm him, and he drifts off into a more peaceful sleep than he has had in days. Master Gilbert, observing this, nods with satisfaction. His methods were clearly working. Next, we have Agnes, the baker's wife, who is suffering from a terrible headache, likely brought on by the stress of believing every cat in the village is a supernatural entity. She summons Master Gilbert. He listens to her symptoms and diagnoses an imbalance caused by agitated spirits in the brain. The cure: cat therapy. You must find a cat, he instructs her, his tone that of a man revealing a great secret, and you must stroke it slowly from the head to the tip of its tail. As you do so, the cat's purr, which is the sound of its internal harmony, will create a vibration that will soothe the agitated spirits in your head. He also recommends that she do this while facing east, but only on a Tuesday for maximum efficacy. Agnes, who is terrified of cats, looks at him as if he has prescribed she should pet a dragon. But the headache is very bad, so she finds a neighbour's friendly ginger cat and with a trembling hand begins to stroke its soft fur. The cat, delighted by the unexpected attention, begins to purr loudly. The rhythm, vibration and the simple calming act of petting the animal actually does make Agnes feel a bit better. She feels her shoulders relax, her breathing deepen, the headache lessens. It is perhaps the world's first recorded instance of purr-based stress relief. But Master Gilbert's greatest and most specific theory involved the black cat, the village's resident dark omen. It was widely believed that malaria, or the Aguilea as it was known, was a disease carried on bad air from the marshes. Master Gilbert had a more specific theory. The ague was a spirit of the swamp, a creature of darkness, and to fight a dark spirit, you needed a darker one. When Thomas the Thatcher came down with a shivering fit of the ague, Master Gilbert prescribed his most daring remedy. He instructed Thomas's wife to find the black cat. She was not to touch it, of course, but she was to try and pluck a few strands of its fur, preferably from its tail, and sew them into a small pouch for Thomas to wear around his neck. It was believed that the fur of a creature that was made of night would repel the dark spirit of the swamp fever. It was that two dark spirits would not want to occupy the same space. This led to the comical scene of Thomas's poor wife spending an entire afternoon trying to sneak up on the village's most elusive creature with a pair of sewing shears, a task roughly as easy as trying to catch smoke in a net. She never did manage to get the fur. Thomas's fever broke a few days later on its own. Master Gilbert, a true innovator, would often give his patients instructions that sound to us like a surrealish. One of his favourite prescriptions for melancholy was this: at the stroke of midnight, you must find a cat. You must not speak. You must simply look into its eyes until it looks away first. Do this for 3 consecutive nights. The cat's independent spirit will shame the melancholy out of your own soul. And so the cat became an unwitting participant in the theatre of medieval medicine. It was a furry hot water bottle, a purring stress ball, and a walking charm against evil spirits. The remedies were absurd, the logic fantastical, but underlying it all was a truth that the villagers were stumbling upon by accident. Maybe medieval doctors knew the secret. Cats aren't medicine, but petting one sure feels therapeutic. The journey of the cat through the medieval imagination has taken us from silent observer to suspected witch's familiar, from bad luck omen to bizarre medical instrument. It seems only fitting that our final stop should be the one place where all of society's anxieties and absurdities are put on public display: the courtroom. It may sound like a flight of fancy, but animal trials were a very real, if rare, phenomenon in the Middle Ages. Animals from pigs to weevils could be formally charged with crimes, brought before a magistrate, and even assigned a lawyer. It was a way of imposing human order on a chaotic natural world. And in our village of Muddle-on-the-Marsh, the time had come for the law to finally address its most mysterious and troublesome resident. The case was the village of Patches, the mottled cat belonging to old Elspeth. The charge was twofold: consorting with a known witch, Elspeth of course, and more pressingly, the deliberate and malicious souring of the week's supply of milk at the dairy. Let us imagine the scene. The trial is held not in a grand hall, but in the largest room of the local tavern, which has been temporarily cleared of its drinking table. The air is thick with the smell of stale ale and nervous sweat. The magistrate, a portly and self-important man named Baron Fitzherbert, sits behind a large table, looking stern. The defendant Patches is present. He is being held, with some difficulty, in the arms of a nervous young bailiff. Patches, for his part, seems entirely unconcerned by the gravity of the situation. He is attempting to groom his left shoulder, occasionally pausing to look at the assembled crowd with an expression of mild curiosity. The prosecution begins. The main witness is, naturally, Prudent, Elspeth's nosy neighbour. She stands before the Baron, her hands clasped, her voice filled with righteous conviction. "I saw it with my own 2 eyes, my lord," she declares. "The accused did sneak into the dairy last Tuesday night. I saw his wicked silhouette pass by the window. And the very next morning was not the entire vat of cream found to be sour and clotted. The bailiff holding Patches coughs. "My lord," he says quietly, "Tuesday was also the warmest day of the year so far. The cream may have simply turned." The Baron glares at the bailiff. "The court does not deal in may-haves," he says sternly. "It deals in witness testimony. Next to testify is Thomas the Thatcher. He is called as a character witness. Against the cat, he recounts, with much dramatic embellishment, the story of how Patches materialised out of thin air in front of Elspeth's cottage. It moves not like a creature of this earth, my lord," he says, his voice low and spooky. "It glides like a spirit of sour milk, no doubt." Patches, growing bored of being held, lets out a soft, plaintive meow. "He speaks," someone in the crowd whispers. "He is casting a spell." A nervous murmur ripples through the room. The most extraordinary part of the proceedings is the defence. Animals on trial were often appointed a lawyer, a real human advocate tasked with the thankless job of defending them. The court had appointed a young, ambitious lawyer named Bartholomew who saw this as an opportunity to make a name for himself, though he had not quite anticipated the challenges of having a cat for a client. Bartholomew stands. He is well prepared. "My lord," he begins, "the prosecution has failed to produce a single witness who actually saw my client souring the milk. They saw him in the vicinity, yes, but Muddle on the Marsh is a small village. My client is in the vicinity of everything." He warms to his theme. "And as for his character, the witness claims my client is a spirit. I ask you to look at the accused." He gestures dramatically towards Patches, who has now fallen asleep in the bailiff's arms, his head lolling to one side, a thin line of drool on his chin. "Does this look like a powerful, malevolent spirit to you, or does it look like a perfectly ordinary and frankly rather lazy cat?" The logic is sound. The crowd seems swayed. But then the prosecution plays its final card. The young, zealous parish priest is called to the stand. He argues that the cat's very nature is an affront. It is a creature of the night, a companion to lonely herb-gathering women. It is silent, proud, and serves no master. Its purring is a strange, hypnotic incantation, its glowing eyes a window to another realm. The trial reaches its climax. The Baron, looking flustered by the theological turn of events and eager to get back to his lunch, clears his throat to deliver his verdict. He looks at the sleeping cat. He looks at the expectant faces of the villagers. He looks at the lawyer, who is trying to discreetly wipe a bit of cat drool off his tunic. "It is clear," the Baron announces, his voice booming, "that this is a creature of profound and troubling mystery." The crowd leans in. However, he continues, "It is also clear that this specific cat is guilty of little more than being a cat." He fixes his gaze on the priest. "And as for the sour milk," he says, "I suggest the dairy build a better door." And so the trial ends. Patches is acquitted, though he slept through the most important moment of his life. Bartholomew the lawyer is hailed as a legal genius, and the villagers of Muddle on the Marsh are left to ponder the deep and complex legal status of their feline neighbours. Justice in its own strange medieval way had been served, though nobody quite knew how. Our journey through the strange and suspicious world of the medieval cat is at an end. We have seen this simple, graceful creature cast as a ghost, a witch's helper, a bad omen, a medical tool, and even a defendant in a court of law. It is a testament to the power of the human imagination to weave stories, to see patterns, and to find mystery in the quietest corners of our lives. Today we see them differently. We see their stealth not as supernatural, but as elegant. We see their independence not as sinister, but as a virtue. And we see their quiet, knowing gaze not as a curse, but as a silent, comforting presence in our homes. So, as you drift off to sleep, perhaps with a soft, furry creature purring nearby, remember the villagers of Muddle on the Marsh. And the next time your cat, with a flick of its tail, deliberately knocks something precious from a high shelf, just smile. Remember, it's not evil. It's just medieval. Sleep well. the accidental executioner, the unexpected job offer in a small, unassuming town in the heart of 13th century England, a town known more for the dampness of its fields than the greatness of its men, lived a young man named Geoffrey. Geoffrey was not a hero, he was not a villain, he possessed no remarkable skills in swordsmanship. His true talents lay in decidedly less marketable areas, such as the ability to perfectly skip a stone across the local pond. 7 skips was his record, and a surprising knack for knowing when it was about to rain simply by observing the behavior of cows. Unfortunately, in a world that valued strong backs and sharp minds, cow watching was not a recognized profession, and so Geoffrey found himself unemployed, a state of being that left him with far too much time to perfect his stone skipping and far too little coin to buy bread. His life changed on a grey Tuesday morning. He was wandering through the town square, trying to look purposeful, when he saw a notice nailed to the thick oak door of the town hall. It was a job posting. In an age where most jobs were inherited or learned through grueling apprenticeships, a formal job notice was a rare and exciting thing. He pushed his way through a small, uninterested crowd to read the elegant script. The notice announced an opening for an assistant to the town justiciar and upholder of the king's final peace. Geoffrey read the words several times. Justiciar. That sounded important. It was a legal term, something to do with justice. Upholder of the king's peace. That sounded noble and respectable. He pictured himself in a smart tunic, perhaps carrying a staff of office, standing beside the town magistrate during court sessions. He imagined nodding gravely, looking official, and maybe helping to keep order if a chicken thief became too unruly. It seemed like the perfect job, stable, secure, and requiring very little heavy lifting or specialized knowledge beyond the ability to stand still and look serious. Brimming with a newfound sense of purpose, he marched into the bailiff's office. The bailiff, a portly man named Master Fitzwilliam, whose desk was buried under a mountain of scrolls and tax records, looked up, annoyed at the interruption. "I'm here about the upholder position," Geoffrey said, trying to make his voice sound deeper and more official. Master Fitzwilliam squinted at him. He saw a young man who was not particularly strong, not particularly imposing, but who was, most importantly, standing in front of him and volunteering. The previous upholder, a grim man named Silas, had retired abruptly last week, citing a bad back and a general weariness of the soul. Finding a replacement had been difficult. No one seemed to want the job. "You have 2 arms and a steady nerve," the bailiff grunted. "Yes, sir," Geoffrey replied eagerly, puffing out his chest. "Good enough. The job requires you to be present at all official pronouncements. It comes with a small stipend and a cottage by the old Gaol. You can start at dawn," and that was it. No lengthy interview, no discussion of duties. Geoffrey was ecstatic. He had a job, a respectable official job with a cottage. He spent the rest of the day in a state of blissful ignorance, telling the few friends he had that he was now an important part of the town's legal system. The next morning he woke before the sun, his heart thrumming with nervous excitement. He put on his best tunic, the one with only 2 noticeable patches, and made his way to the town gaol, a squat, grim-looking stone building he had previously made a point to avoid. He found an old man sweeping the steps, a figure so stooped and wary he looked as though he were held together by dust and regret. "Good morning," Geoffrey said cheerfully. "I am Geoffrey, the new assistant justiciar. I'm here to report for duty." The old man stopped sweeping and looked Geoffrey up and down with tired, watery eyes. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face, a smile utterly devoid of joy. "Ah," he wheezed, "the new lad. I'm Silas, the old assistant." "A pleasure to meet you, Master Silas," Geoffrey said with a respectful bow. "Where might I find the justiciar? I am ready to uphold the peace." Silas chuckled, a dry, rattling sound like stones in a bucket. "The upholding part, lad, comes at the end. First, you need to get acquainted with your tools." He gestured with his broom towards a small, heavy wooden door at the side of the gaol. "Your workshop is in there. I left everything in order for you." Thinking the tools might be a staff of office or perhaps a ceremonial scroll, Geoffrey pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small, dark, and smelled of damp earth and rust. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he began to make out the shapes within. Hanging on the wall was not a staff, but a collection of enormous axes, their blades dark and menacing. One was a colossal, double-headed affair that looked capable of felling an ancient oak. Next to it was a long, heavy-bladed sword, clearly designed not for elegant dueling, but for brutal, powerful chops. In the corner stood a coil of thick rope and a frightening black leather mask with empty, staring eye holes. Geoffrey froze, a cold wave of understanding washing over him. This wasn't a clerk's office. This was a place of grim final work. He backed out of the room slowly, his face pale. "There's been a terrible mistake," he stammered to Silas. I thought I was to be a legal assistant." Silas leaned on his broom and sighed. "Ah, yes, the bailiff likes his fancy words. Upholder of the king's final peace. A pretty way of putting it, isn't it? The peace is the one that comes after the head has been parted from the shoulders." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "You mean I'm the—" He couldn't even bring himself to say the word. Headsman. "The chopper, the executioner," Silas finished for him, his tone matter-of-fact. "And a fine job it is. A cottage, a steady wage, and people tend to give you plenty of space in the market. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a date with a rocking chair and a pint of ale that I've been looking forward to for 20 years. Panic seized Geoffrey. He turned and ran back to the bailiff's office, bursting through the door. "Master Fitzwilliam, I can't do it. I'm not an executioner." The bailiff didn't even look up from his paperwork. "You signed the town roll, Geoffrey. The position is filled. You start today." He finally raised his eyes, a flicker of something that might have been pity in them. "Look at it this way," he said, trying to be helpful. "It's just chopping wood, but with more drama." Geoffrey's attempt to quit his new career ended before it truly began. The bailiff's final words echoed in his ears, a phrase of such breathtaking oversimplification that it left him utterly speechless. He stumbled out of the office, the signed town roll now feeling like a binding contract with fate itself. Defeated, he made the slow walk back to the gaol, each step heavier than the last, his mind a swirling fog of panic and resignation. The respectable life he had imagined, the nodding, the staff of office, the civic importance had dissolved into a grim, sharp-edged reality. He was now standing once more before the small, heavy door of his new workshop. His workshop. The thought itself was absurd. He took a deep, shaky breath, the cool, damp air doing little to calm the frantic beating of his heart, and pushed the door open again. This time, he forced himself to truly look, to take in the tools of his horrifying new trade. The room was just as he remembered, small, windowless, and steeped in a silence that felt ancient and profound. The air smelled of cold stone, roughed, and the faint, unsettling scent of old leather and oiled metal. It was a smell of grim purpose. His gaze fell first upon the mask. It was hanging from a rusty nail, a hood of thick black leather, stiff with age. The eye holes were rough cut and empty, giving it a vacant, almost mournful expression. A family of mice had at some point decided that the left cheek was an excellent source of nesting material, leaving behind a small, ragged hole. Geoffrey found himself wondering with a strange sense of detachment who the mask was meant to frighten more, the condemned soul on the block, or the man forced to wear it. His eyes then drifted to the main attractions hanging on the wall. There were 2 axes. One was clearly the workhorse of the operation. It was enormous, a beast of iron and wood. The handle, worn smooth and dark from years of use, was as long as Geoffrey's arm. The head was a single broad crescent of dark, pitted iron, its edge marked with countless small nicks and imperfections. It looked less like a tool and more like a historical artifact, a thing that had seen too much. It seemed to possess a personality of its own, a heavy, weary sigh forged in metal. Geoffrey felt an irrational urge to give it a name, something like Old Bessie or The Complainer. Beside it hung its more elegant cousin, a great sword. It was almost as tall as Geoffrey himself, with a long, plain crossguard and a heavy, brutal-looking blade that widened near the tip. This was not a knight's sword, designed for parrying and thrusting. This was a tool of pure leverage and gravity, designed for one specific downward motion. Its very existence was a statement of grim finality. Geoffrey reached out a trembling hand and lightly touched the flat of the blade. It was cold, unnervingly so, a deep, profound cold that seemed to seep into his fingertips and travel up his arm. He pulled his hand back as if he'd been burned. In the corner he saw the rope again. It wasn't the clean, fibrous rope used by sailors or farmers. This rope was thick, stiff, and stained with a dark, greasy patina from years of use and weather. It was coiled like a sleeping serpent, and Geoffrey had no desire to wake it. He knew he couldn't put it off any longer. If this was to be his life, he had to at least understand the feel of it. He decided to start with the main axe, Old Bessie. He wrapped his hands around the smooth, worn handle. The wood felt strangely comforting, like an old farmer's tool. Then he tried to lift it from its pegs. The weight was staggering. It was a dead, immovable heaviness that shocked his unprepared muscles. He grunted, bending his knees and putting his back into it as if trying to lift a fallen log. With a great straining effort, he managed to heave the axe from the wall, and immediately his world became a terrifying struggle against gravity. The immense weight of the axe head pulled him forward, forcing him to stumble into the center of the small room. He was no longer holding the axe was holding him. It was a clumsy, terrifying dance, with Geoffrey's feet scrambling to keep up with the axe's relentless desire to meet the floor. He tried to raise it, to mimic the swing of a woodcutter, but he could barely lift the head to his waist. It was like trying to swing a small anvil tied to the end of a stick. His arms trembled, sweat beating on his forehead. This was impossible. He wasn't strong enough. He was a stone skipper, not a giant. Just outside the workshop door, life went on. Geoffrey caught a glimpse of his new colleagues, though he dared not speak to them. There was Barnaby, the jailer, a man whose gut preceded him by a good few seconds. He was fumbling with a large iron ring of keys, trying to lock a cell door. He swayed slightly on his feet, and even from a distance, Geoffrey could smell the faint, sweet scent of stale ale that seemed to follow him like a cloud. This was the man in charge of keeping prisoners secure. A little further down, slumped against the damp stone wall of the gaol, was a town guard. His helmet was tilted over his eyes, his spear was resting against his shoulder, and his gentle, rhythmic snoring was just barely audible. The town's security, Geoffrey mused, was relaxed. This thought provided no comfort. It only made his own new role feel more solitary, more bizarre. He was surrounded by a cast of characters who seemed to have wandered out of a tavern tale. Taking a deep breath, he decided to try one more time. He had to know if he could even swing the axe. He planted his feet firmly, took a deep breath, and with a guttural yell born more of fear than effort, he heaved the giant axe upwards. For a glorious, terrifying half-second, he had it level. Then physics took over. The weight was too much. His grip slipped. The axe handle twisted in his hands, and the great iron head swung down in an uncontrolled arc. It did not hit the floor. It swung wide, missing his leg by a hair's breadth, and struck the stone wall of the workshop with a deafening, echoing clang. Sparks flew. The sound was immense, a sound of pure, metallic protest that shattered the morning's quiet. It reverberated through the gaol, a sound so loud and out of place that it seemed to startle the very stones. In the courtyard, Barnaby the jailer stopped fumbling with his keys. The snoring guard jolted awake, his helmet clattering against the wall. They both turned their heads, their movements slow and lazy, and stared at the workshop door where Geoffrey stood, frozen, his hands still tingling from the impact. They didn't look angry. They didn't look surprised. They looked at him with an expression of profound, weary pity. It was the look one gives a newborn foal as it struggles to find its feet. Mortified, his face burning with a shame hotter than any forge, Geoffrey scrambled to pick up the axe now lying innocently on the floor. He hung it back on its pegs with a clumsy heave and retreated into the darkest corner of his new office. He slid down the wall to sit on the cold, damp floor, surrounded by the silent, judging tools of his profession. This was his life now. He was a failure before he had even begun. He closed his eyes, and a piece of advice he hadn't even realized he'd heard Silas say came back to him, a ghostly whisper in the ringing silence of his failure. Just swing and hope for the best. It wasn't advice. It was a prophecy of chaos. The ringing in Geoffrey's ears from his accidental assault on the workshop wall eventually faded, but the echo of his failure lingered for days. He developed a new, nervous habit of walking with his shoulders hunched, as if trying to make himself smaller and less noticeable. Every time he saw Barnaby the jailer or the now flush of shame and quickly find something interesting to look at in the opposite direction. But the job, with its grim responsibilities, would not let him hide forever. The bailiff had been clear. An execution was scheduled for the end of the month. Geoffrey had to learn, and he had to learn quickly. His training ground was a small, muddy courtyard behind the gaol, a sad patch of earth enclosed by a crumbling stone wall and a rickety wooden fence. It was a place that felt forgotten by the sun, and in the centre of this courtyard stood his training partner, a man-shaped dummy, crudely stitched together from old burlap sacks and stuffed with straw. It had a lopsided, vacant-for look with 2 charcoal smudges for eyes and a turnip for a head, which was already beginning to look a bit soft. Geoffrey decided to call him Bartholomew. It seemed only polite to know the name of the person you were about to repeatedly and ineptly fail to execute. He dragged the great heavy executioner's axe, his nemesis, old Bessie, from the workshop out into the courtyard. The journey of 20 paces left him breathless and sweating. He stood before Bartholomew, the axe resting on the ground, and tried to gather his thoughts. He needed a plan. He had seen woodcutters at work. It was all in the hips, they said. A fluid, powerful motion. He tried to picture it, to visualize success. He hoisted the axe onto his shoulder. The immense weight immediately threw him off balance. He wobbled, taking a few clumsy, shuffling steps to the side, like a man trying to dance with a sleeping bear. He corrected his stance, his knuckles white, his arms trembling from the strain. This was not a tool for elegant swinging. It was a battle against physics, and he was losing. He took a deep, shaky breath, closed his eyes for a moment, and swung. The result was not the clean, whistling arc he had imagined. It was a slow, clumsy, and terrifyingly uncontrolled heave. The axe's momentum was a force of nature. It pulled him around in a half-sector, his feet tangling beneath him. He didn't so much swing the axe as the axe swung him. He let out a small yelp as he staggered, and the axe head, missing Bartholomew completely, buried itself with a sickening thunk into the top rail of the rickety wooden fence. There was a loud crack of splintering wood. The axe was stuck. Geoffrey stood there for a moment, panting, his arms vibrating from the impact. The fence post now sported a huge, ugly gash, and his axe was firmly embedded within it. It took him a full minute of sweaty, desperate wiggling and pulling to wrench it free. He had failed to execute a stationary straw dummy and had instead successfully wounded a piece of municipal property. From over the wall, he heard a new sound, a soft, suppressed giggle. He peered towards the noise and saw 2 small, dirty faces, children from a nearby cottage, peeking over the stonework, their eyes wide with amusement. They saw him looking and quickly ducked back down, but it was too late. He had an audience. His cheeks burned with a fresh wave of humiliation. He decided to try a different approach. Power was clearly not his strength. Perhaps precision was the key. He would aim for a single perfect strike. He stood closer to Bartholomew, narrowed his eyes in what he hoped was a look of intense focus, and tried a shorter, more controlled chop aimed directly at the turnip head. This time he didn't lose his balance, but in his intense focus on the target he misjudged the weight and the angle. The heavy iron head dipped lower than he intended. Instead of cleaving the turnip, the axe head skimmed underneath it and plunged into the soft, muddy ground at the dummy's base, sending a great spray of wet earth and pebbles into the air. Most of it landed on Geoffrey's own tunic. He now looked not like a fearsome executioner, but like a farmer who had spectacularly failed at digging a hole. He knew a part of the job was about presence, about projecting an aura of grim authority. He put the axe down, took a deep breath, and decided to practice his demeanour. He put on the mouse-eaten leather mask. It smelled of old sweat and regret. He puffed out his chest and tried to adopt a menacing stance. He attempted a low, guttural growl, something that might strike fear into the hearts of wrongdoers, but his nerves got the better of him, and the sound that emerged was less of a growl and more of a high-pitched, anxious squeak. The two children peeked over the wall again, and this time they didn't even try to hide their laughter. They were joined by a baker from the nearby shop, his apron still white with flour, who shook his head with a broad, pitying smile. Geoffrey felt his spirit crumble. He was a joke. He ripped the mask from his head and threw it to the ground. This was impossible. He was a stone skipper, a rain predictor. He was not meant for this grim theatrical violence. He was about to give up for the day when Barnaby, the portly, ale-scented jailer, happened to wander into the courtyard. He took in the scene with a single, sweeping glance. Geoffrey, covered in mud and despair, the wounded fence, the trench in the ground, the lopsided, still intact straw dummy. Barnaby watched as Geoffrey, in one last desperate attempt, swung the axe again, this time missing so completely that the force spun him all the way around, ending with him facing the wrong direction. The jailer slowly shook his head, a wry, almost compassionate smile on his face. He didn't stop or offer any real advice. He just called out as he continued on his way, his voice carrying across the muddy yard. "It's normal," he said, his tone casual. "Every executioner embarrasses himself the first week or 2, or 10. The words were meant to be comforting, but they landed on Geoffrey with the weight of a prophecy. 10 weeks of this public, muddy, soul-crushing humiliation. He sank to the ground, his back against the unexecuted Bartholomew, and stared at the axe lying in the mud. He had not just failed at the task, he had failed at looking like he could even attempt the task. The drama the bailiff had promised was turning out to be a comedy, and he was its unwilling star. The days leading up to the scheduled execution passed for Geoffrey in a slow, agonizing crawl. Time, which had once been a friend to be idled away by the river, had become a cruel warden, marching him relentlessly towards a fate he felt utterly unprepared for. The words of the jailer Barnaby, "Every executioner embarrasses himself the first week or 2 or 10, had become a grim mantra, echoing in his mind during the long, quiet hours of the night. His disastrous training sessions in the courtyard had ceased. There was, he had decided, no point in further traumatizing himself or providing more free entertainment for the neighborhood children. Bartholomew, the straw dummy, remained peacefully intact, a silent, lopsided monument to Geoffrey's profound incompetence. Sleep, once a welcome refuge, became a shallow and troubled state. Geoffrey would lie on his thin straw mattress in the small, damp cottage that had once seemed like such a prize. He would listen to the sounds of the night, sounds he had never noticed before, the lonely hoot of an owl, the distant, mournful howl of a dog, and most unnervingly, the soft, rhythmic sound of hammering that started a few days before the event. It was the sound of the town carpenter erecting the wooden scaffold in the centre of the square. Each hammer blow felt like a nail being driven into his own coffin. He tried to prepare himself, to master his nerves through sheer force of will. He knew he needed to look the part, and so he began a ritual of speaking to himself in his mirror, a small, round disc of polished bronze he had found in the workshop. The reflection it offered was a dim, distorted, ghostly version of himself. His face appeared longer, his eyes dark, shadowy pools of fear. He would stare into this blurry image of his own anxiety and try to practice his executioner's fate. "You are the king's justice," he would whisper to the strange, warped man in the bronze. His voice would tremble. "You are the final piece." He would try to scowl, to look menacing and grim. The result was less terrifying and more like he had just bitten into a very sour lemon. The distorted reflection seemed to mock him, its wobbly mouth twisted in a pitying grimace. The pep talks always ended with him sighing and sitting back down on his stool, more demoralized than when he started. He decided that if he couldn't master the role, perhaps he could master the tool. He left old Bessie hanging in the workshop and focused his attention on the simple task of chopping firewood for his cottage hearth. The bailiff's words came back, it did not. His anxiety made him clumsy and hesitant. He would line up a log, take a deep breath, swing and miss entirely, the small hand axe biting into the dirt beside the chopping block. When he did manage to connect, his blows were weak, glancing off the wood with a pathetic thwack. He spent an entire afternoon trying to split a single stubborn log of oak. He ended up with a pile of splinters, a blister on his palm, and the unshakable conviction that he was, on a fundamental level, allergic to swinging any object with a sharp metal head. The local birds, watching from the safety of a nearby tree, seemed to chirp in amusement. What made his private terror all the more acute was the mood in the town itself. For everyone else, the upcoming execution was not a grim duty, it was a festival. A morbid and unsettling excitement began to build. Farmers from the surrounding countryside made plans to come into town, not just for the market but for the main event. Travelling merchants, sensing an opportunity, began to arrive, their carts laden with cheap trinkets and meat pies. The local tavern cleaned its mugs and ordered an extra barrel of ale. It was a public holiday, a spectacle, a piece of thrilling, grisly theatre, and Geoffrey was its unwilling star performer. He tried to find peace by taking long, aimless walks through the town in the evenings, hoping to clear his head. This proved to be a tactical error. The townspeople, now fully aware of his identity and his impending duty, felt the need to offer him words of encouragement. Their attempts at support were universally, comically unhelpful. The baker, seeing Geoffrey pass, would call out cheerfully, "Getting in a good walk, Master Headsman. Keep your arms loose. It's all in the shoulders, I hear." The blacksmith, a man with arms like tree trunks, clapped him on the back so hard it nearly sent Geoffrey stumbling into a gutter. "Don't you worry, lad," he boomed. "I put a fresh edge on the big axe for you this morning. It's sharp enough to split a hair. Or, well, you know," he finished with a wink that did nothing to soothe Geoffrey's nerves. Even the vicar, a kindly old man, offered some spiritual guidance that went terribly wrong. "Remember, my son," he said, placing a gentle hand on Geoffrey's shoulder, "you are but an instrument of God's will. Do not let the burden weigh too heavily upon you." But all Geoffrey could think was that an instrument like an axe could be clumsy and ineffective in the wrong hands. He felt utterly alone in his anxiety. He was the only person in the entire town who was not looking forward to the event. The condemned man himself, a notorious horse thief named One-Eyed Jack, was reportedly in high spirits, enjoying the free food and drink provided to him in his final days. Geoffrey heard the guards say that Jack was practicing his final words, hoping to get a laugh from the crowd. Everyone, it seemed, was preparing for their role in the play except him. The night before the execution was the longest night of Geoffrey's life. He lay on his pallet in his cottage, staring up into the impenetrable darkness. The festive sounds from the tavern, singing, laughter, the occasional cheer, drifted through his small window, each sound a tiny needle of dread. He tried to think of anything else. He thought of the river, of the smooth, flat stones resting on the bank. He thought of the cows in the meadow, their calm, chewing faces. He thought of his life before the job notice, a life of simple, blissful, penniless obscurity. He had wanted a respectable job. He had wanted a purpose. Now he would give anything to go back to being Geoffrey the cow watcher, the man with no prospects and no responsibilities. He closed his eyes, but all he could see was a sea of expectant faces, all turned towards him on the scaffold. He rolled over, pulling his thin wool blanket over his head, as if he could hide from the coming dawn. And in the quiet desperation of the night, a single weary thought formed in his mind, a lament for a life he had never appreciated until now. Maybe farming wasn't so bad after all. The dawn arrived not with a thunderclap of judgment, but with a soft, grey, indifferent light that filtered through Geoffrey's small window. It was the day. His stomach felt like a tangled knot of eels. He couldn't eat, he couldn't think. All he could do was mechanically go through the motions of preparing for the most important and most terrifying day of his life. He pulled on his work tunic, and with trembling hands he picked up the mouse-eaten leather mask. It felt cold and strangely heavy, like the physical embodiment of his dread. As he walked from his cottage towards the town square, the festive atmosphere hit him like a physical blow. The square was packed. It felt as though the entire county had turned out for the occasion. The air was thick with the smell of roasting meat from a vendor's cart, the sweet scent of ale, and the murmur of 1,000 excited voices. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders to get a better view. It was a carnival, and the scaffold in the centre was its main stage. Geoffrey, his face hidden behind the grim leather hood, felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were watching himself from a great distance. He was led through the crowd by 2 guards, the people parting before him, not with fear, but with a kind of curious, encouraging respect. He heard someone whisper, "There he is." The new headsman. It didn't sound menacing. It sounded like they were pointing out a local celebrity. He reached the steps of the scaffold. They seemed as tall as a mountain. He placed a wobbly foot on the first step and began to climb, his knees feeling like jelly. When he reached the top, the full scene hit him. The sea of faces all turned expectantly towards him. The vicar looking stern and official, the vicar looking pious and concerned, and in the centre of it all, kneeling beside the wooden block, was the condemned man, One-Eyed Jack. Jack looked up at Geoffrey, and to Geoffrey's utter astonishment, the horse thief gave him a cheerful, gap-to-toothed grin and a small, encouraging nod. Geoffrey's mind went blank. It felt even heavier today, weighted down with the expectations of the entire town. He hoisted it up. He meant to lift it onto his shoulder in a single, powerful, intimidating gesture, but his hands were slick with sweat, his nerves were frayed, and the axe was, as always, a cruel and unforgiving dance partner. His grip faltered for a fraction of a second. It was enough. The heavy iron head tipped forward, pulling the handle from his grasp. Time seemed to slow down. He watched, horrified, as the axe tumbled from his hands, struck the wooden floor of the scaffold with a deafening clang, bounced once, and then tumbled ignominiously off the edge, landing in the mud below with a soft, pathetic thud. A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was followed by a moment of stunned silence. Then, from the back, a single loud laugh erupted. It was followed by another, and then another. A wave of unrestrained, good-natured laughter rippled through the square. Mortified beyond words, Geoffrey scrambled to the edge of the scaffold. He had to retrieve the axe. As he bent down, the poorly fitting leather mask, already askew from his panic, slid forward over his eyes and then fell completely off his head, landing at his feet. His face was revealed. His identity was no longer a grim mystery. He was just Geoffrey, the boy who skipped stones, the clumsy fellow who had been seen terrorizing a straw dummy. The crowd, seeing his familiar, panicked face, did not jeer, they cheered. They roared with laughter and affection. "Go on, Jeff," someone shouted. "You can do it." They were treating it not as an execution, but as a local sporting event, and he was their bumbling, lovable hometown champion. Geoffrey stood there, his face burning, his mind reeling. He looked at One-Eyed Jack, who was now shaking with silent laughter, his shoulders bobbing up and down. The horse thief looked up at Geoffrey, his one good eye twinkling with mirth. "Careful with that, lad," Jack said, his voice loud enough for the front rows to hear. "It looks a bit heavy for you. Do you need a hand?" The crowd howled with delight. This was no longer an execution. It was a comedy duo. Geoffrey, flustered and desperate, could only stammer, "No, I think I have it." He eventually retrieved the axe and stumbled back to the centre of the scaffold, but the atmosphere was irrevocably broken. The solemnity was gone, replaced by pure farce. Presiding over the event was a visiting baron. A man known for his stern demeanour, but also, it turned out, his love of a good show. He had been watching the entire debacle from a high-backed chair, his face at first a mask of stern disapproval, which had slowly melted into a bemused smile, and was now a full, rumbling belly laugh. He raised a hand for silence. The crowd quieted down, eager to hear what he would say. The Baron looked at the laughing prisoner, then at the mortified executioner, and then out at the cheerful, entertained crowd. "It seems to me," the Baron declared, his voice booming across the square, "that the heavens themselves do not wish for this man to die today. Any man who can face his final moments with such good humour, and any executioner who can so thoroughly entertain the entire town, has earned a reprieve." He smiled broadly. "By my authority, I hereby pardon this prisoner." The roar from the crowd was deafening. It was a roar of pure joy and celebration. One-aged Jack leapt to his feet and, to Geoffrey's complete shock, threw his arms around him in a grateful hug. The guards, laughing themselves, unlocked his chains. Later that evening, Geoffrey found himself in the tavern, a mug of the finest ale in his hand. The entire town was celebrating, and he was, inexplicably, the hero of the hour. They slapped him on the back, they bought him drinks, they praised his unique style. Sitting at a table with him, laughing the loudest of all, was one-eyed Jack, who had just sworn to give up horse thievery and perhaps take up comedy. Geoffrey took a long, deep drink of his ale. He felt a profound sense of relief, a lightness he hadn't felt in weeks. He was still the town executioner, but he had a feeling he wouldn't be very busy. He smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile. "Turns out," he thought to himself, "I was the worst executioner, but maybe that's exactly what this town needed.